Hey, so this is going to be a little bit more information about podcasting in general. So, we're on a research database, and this database is going to be about podcasting. So, I'm going to go ahead and type in podcasting, and together we're going to do a little bit of research and see what we can find out about the idea of podcasting in general. And as we look, I want to move myself over this direction and see if we can find any good articles, particularly on podcasting. Examining the motives of podcast users. So this might be a good one right here. Then we have characterizing podcast services. This one might be a good one right here. So right away we see a couple of decent ones. Now this one is in 2010, it's 2022. I would I would personally like to see one in the last 5 years. So we have 15,000 results. Let's go ahead and clear up a little bit of this. We're going to get it all the way up to, I'd say, 2013, 2012. Let's do 2013. There we go. And we have some older ones. And right away, you don't see a ton of recent information on it. You do see here we have something in Nurse Educator, podcasting undergrad nursing programs, which is actually a pretty interesting article, it seems like. Podcast use in undergraduate medical education. This looks very interesting. It's within the last 5 years. Let's take a look and see if we can get a hand on the full text. And I will see you in a moment. I will transfer over to the full text. All right, so we are back. And all right, so we are back. Sorry about that. I was having a little bit of difficulty making sure I wasn't paused. We are back, and we're going to go ahead and go over some of this information. We went to Google Scholar where we found this article that we got from Site, and we're going to go over podcast use in undergraduate medical education. And I'm someone that studied medical school and medical education extensively. So for me, this is going to be a really helpful tool. So let's go ahead and take a look at the abstract. It says podcasts have become, excuse me, got a little bit of filler. Podcasts have become increasingly popular, as I mentioned, for free open access medical education. Okay, which is got its own acronym FOAM. However, little research has been examined on the use of these extracurricular audio podcasts as tools in undergraduate medical education. So this study it aimed to examine knowledge retention, usage conditions, and preferences of undergraduate medical students at a Canadian university interacting with extracurricular podcasting. So it performed a study and it looked into how podcasting is influencing medical education. So, one thing I take from this right away is if you don't have a podcast, this is probably a good idea for you to consider the option of a podcast. I heard blogs have been very efficient for people for making money and income. And I've heard now that 1 billion blogs are in circulation. Now, for context, there's 9 billion people in the world. So for every 9 people, there is a blog out. So it is a saturated market to blog, but blogging still has many benefits and it still brings in quite a bit of financial monetization. It brings in a lot of knowledge and it brings in a great source of importance and happiness. Okay. And I'm sorry, I took a quick break to hear my child. She was asking for me. Okay, so one thing I would do with that information is look at how being an influencer, being someone with a voice has taken a big part of the work environment. So much so that's even infiltrated medical education, which is not a bad place to be if you're one of these types of revenues and pathways. So, furthermore, if you look at a blog, you look at a podcast, and a podcast essentially, in many ways, is which we already know is a type of blog, which is an audio format. And with people on the go, with people having so much access to their phones and access to specific things they do with their education and access to a lot of different resources, it's going to be harder for them to actually sit down and look at a blog and read a blog or even write a blog. But a podcast is far more efficient in some manners because you can just listen to an audio while you drive. You can listen to an audio while you take a shower. These are things I do regularly. I listen to an audio when I work out, or I listen to an audio when I'm packing up from work. I listen to an audio when I'm laying down. I do like to read. I think reading is incredibly important, and I think the retention is going to be something that we're going to have to watch out for. And this article specifically talks about the use of research to examine how the retention of knowledge is going to be um, taken in from the audio podcasts. Now, I'll tell you right now, I'm an audio learner. I've always been that way. When I was in school, I could not have my eyes on a board, and I didn't have the best eyesight either. I think I'm one check away from needing glasses, um, but you know, I don't need them. But I'm not. My point is, I don't have the best vision. It's not bad, but it's not the best. So when we talk about audio learners, I am an audio learner. I've always been an audio learner. I can learn math, I can learn history, I can learn English by not looking, but just hearing. And in my brain, I probably see what's going on. There's a lot of people like me, and there's a lot of people who are visual learners. They have to see it. They have to see it on the board. They do well being in the front of the class. I'm an audio learner. I do best with both. Um, Now let's take though the idea of space repetition and active recall. With active recall as a learning technique, you are actively drawing on your recalled information that you've learned. So if you learn something, you're actively recalling that information. Now, with space repetition, you're spacing out the amount of times you're doing active recall. So, for example, instead of learning Spanish for an hour once a week, you may be learning Spanish for 30 minutes twice a week. And if you do it that way, studies have shown that results are far better for you. And if in the future that's something you want to see, we can actually pull up the studies and pull up the examples. This isn't a video on active recall or space repetition, but these are just points I would like to drive in that when it comes to podcast retention of information, what I'm looking for and what I understand is helpful as a teacher and an educator is active recall and space repetition. I don't necessarily think that excuse me, the visual aspect has to be a part of the lecture. I think the active recall and spaced repetition. Now, where I do think the visual um, representation helps is that it keeps you more in the zone to to put in the focus necessary so later on you can have the active recall and space repetition. It's far easier if I'm not watching someone speak a lecture for me to tone out, for me to get distracted, for me to think about something else. If I'm watching them, then I have another point of focus. I have the audio and I have the visual, and that helps me to not get so spaced out so I can actually absorb what they're saying and what they're talking about, and gives me more information. So that's my point of focus on that at least. Now, if you look at, for example, if you look at the ideas of a podcast, and it's a podcast of something that you're interested in or you've convinced yourself to be interested in enough, you might actually be okay to really absorb the information while you're multitasking, while you're doing dishes. Um, I, for one, I like to have podcasts on where I can watch the actual host. That actually is beneficial for me. But at the same token, most of the time I don't even watch the host. I put the phone down. I'm doing dishes. I'm cleaning up a mess. I'm packing up. I'm in the car. But every once in a while, I do look back at the host and I refer back to the host. I refer back to what they're doing, what they're saying, the look on their face, and that does help me. So I think those are the best of all worlds. But an audio podcast can be extremely beneficial, and I think for the most part, we're going to want to look at retention based off of spaced repetition and active recall. Those are going to be the two things for retention. And another key element of this is going to be focus. Are you focusing when you're listening to the podcast? Are you giving it its due amount of attention where you're actually listening intently? Because if you're not listening intently and it's going in one ear and out the other, um, you're going to miss a lot of it. And there's going to be little room for you to actually draw upon active recall. And the spaced repetition wouldn't necessarily help you if you aren't listening. Still would to some degree. So the question is, are you are you more prone to do a better job if it's visual or excuse me, visual with the audio? I believe so. And I believe so because you're less likely to not be focused. You're more likely to be focused with both. You're more likely to give an extra second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds of focus, intent focus if you have both options available. Um, I just think that you're less likely to get distracted if you have both elements. So that's something that I would highly look into, and I suggest you look into as well. The idea of podcasting with doing so, you want to keep in mind having an audio source would be great, but for those who might need a little bit of extra help, having a audio visual source would be great as well. Um, I personally like to listen to podcasts that have an audio visual source. More often than not, I'm not watching, I'm just listening. But having both components definitely makes a big difference in my concentration, even if it's not necessarily the actual visual of the podcasters. It can just be a visual of a background or whatnot. But it helps me to actually have some sort of visual going on. Obviously, I would say the visual of the actual podcasters would be great. If there's a visual of a background with the podcast going on over it, that's not as bad, but it seems to help me from losing focus. It seems to help me retain a lot of my focus and a lot of my efforts to hear what's going on. So I hope that's been helpful. And I liked some of the research that we found right away on podcasting. Let's go into the results. Looks like 42 students were recruited for the study. Participants who completed assessments for learning. Conclusion: it's one of the studies examine extracurricular podcast usage data and preferences in Canadian undergraduate education. Information helps educators. All right, I would like to get to, let's go down. I would like to get to the results. Okay, due to the nature, we're unable to determine the number of times each podcast was listened to by the uh, students. Excuse me. So there wasn't a whole lot of clear cut. There's some limitations. We always want to know the limitations. Let's go into conclusions. So it's concluded audio podcasts can be a resource for extracurricular learning and medical education, which is great. While interacting with the podcast, majority of students were simultaneously engaged in other activities, which we talked about, which we expected. Top three were driving, how completing chores, and exercising. And I called that because that's exactly what I do to a T. Students indicated that they preferred podcasts of 30 minutes or shorter, okay, and felt that visuals or concluding summary would benefit the learning. Yep, we talked about that. So right on pace with exactly what we talked about. So we're gonna have more information on podcast styled convos, and we will be having guests soon, where we will go into their world and figure out what we can learn and how we can benefit. So thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. I really appreciate you being here for this video, and I had a great time making it. So we will be back with more information and see you soon.